Welcome to my channel.
On a night like this, London hides its darkest secrets. And somewhere in this fog, a killer still walks free.
It was in the latter days of November, in the year 1889, that a singular gloom had settled not only over the sprawling metropolis of London, but also over the spirit of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For the better part of a week, a thick yellow fog, that acrid pea-souper peculiar to our city, had choked the streets, reducing visibility to a mere yard and muffling the rattle of hansom cabs into ghostly whispers. Confined to our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, Holmes had become a creature of restless energy. His great mind, lacking the fuel of a challenging problem, turned inward, threatening to devour itself. He had spent the previous 2 days alternately pacing the sitting-room floor with the frantic energy of a caged panther and slouched in his armchair, scraping away at his violin with a ferocity that produced sounds less like music and more like the cries of a tormented soul. On this particular evening, the violin had happily been set aside in favor of a volatile chemical experiment. Holmes stood hunched over a retort bubbling over a Bunsen burner, his sharp features illuminated by the unnatural blue flame. The air was thick with the pungent smell of nitrates. "Watson," he murmured without turning from his glassware, "I perceive that your practice is quiet, and the weather has dampened your enthusiasm for an evening stroll." I looked up from my newspaper, accustomed to his deductions. "The fog is undeniable, Holmes, but how do you know my patient list is thin?" "Your boots, Doctor. You have not left the house since midday yesterday. The slight crust of mud on the instep is of a particular reddish clay found near the excavations in Paddington, where you attended that unfortunate foreman. Had you been out today, the London slime would have overlaid it entirely." Before I could express my customary astonishment, a sharp ring of the bell downstairs shattered the quiet. Holmes froze, a pipette hovering over a beaker. His lassitude vanished instantly, replaced by the intense, predatory alertness that defined him when the game was afoot. "A late visitor," I remarked, glancing at the clock, which showed past 11, "and one in a state of considerable agitation, if the violence of that ring is any indication," Holmes added, turning down the gas burner. "Unless I am very much mistaken, we are about to receive Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. No one else rings a bell with quite that mixture of official urgency and personal desperation." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in the little ferret-like inspector. Lestrade looked haggard. His bowler hat was dripping with condensation, and his usually neat coat was splattered with a greasy residue of the London streets. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade nodded tersely, moving immediately to the fire to warm his hands. "I apologize for the hour, but the Yard has a situation that has evidently baffled you, Lestrade, or you would not be standing on my rug dripping Thames water," Holmes observed dryly, offering the inspector a chair. "Sit down, man. Watson, perhaps a brandy for the inspector to cut through the chill." Lestrade took the offered glass with gratitude. "You are right, Mr. Holmes. I'll not pretend otherwise. We have a body, and we have a riddle that makes no sense whatsoever. Facts, Lestrade." "Give me the data," Holmes commanded, leaning forward, his eyes glittering. "It is the matter of Mr. Alistair Croft," Lestrade began, the brandy bringing a little colour back to his pale cheeks. "You know the name. The senior partner at Croft and Willoughby bullion brokers in the city," I interjected. "A man of immense reputation and wealth, highly respectable." "The very same," Lestrade confirmed. "An hour ago, just as the clock struck midnight, a constable on his beat discovered Mr. Croft's body in Pentecost Alley." Holmes's eyebrows shot up. "Pentecost Alley?" "That narrow, grim little dead end off Fleet Street, wedged behind the printing offices. A strange place for a city magnate at such an hour, precisely, Mr. Holmes. It's a vile spot, usually frequented only by dustmen and the lowest sort of night walker. Croft was lying face up on the cobblestones at the deepest end of the alley, near the blank brick wall of a warehouse. Cause of death? Holmes asked sharply. Lestrade hesitated, swirling the remains of his brandy. That is the first impossibility, sir. There isn't a mark on him, no wound, no bruise, no sign of poison on the lips. His clothes are unruffled. He looks as though he simply lay down in that filth and died of fright. His eyes, they were wide open, staring up into the fog with an expression of sheer, abject terror. Robbery, then? I suggested. Perhaps frightened to death by footpads. We thought so initially, Doctor. But his gold half-hunter watch, worth 50 guineas if it's worth a shilling, was still in his waistcoat pocket. His diamond stick-pin was untouched. Yet his wallet was empty of currency, and crucially his leather document case, which his clerk says he carried everywhere, was missing. Holmes laced his long fingers together, resting his chin upon them. A selective thief. Interesting. But you spoke of a riddle, Lestrade. Surely a death from natural causes in an unsavory location, combined with opportunistic theft, is not beyond the Yard's capacities. Lestrade leaned forward, his voice dropping. Here is the rub, Mr. Holmes. The body was found at midnight, still warm. The constable is certain the alley was empty on his previous pass at 11 o'clock. Yet we have 3 unimpeachable witnesses, 2 judges and a bishop, who swear on their honour that they were playing whist with Alistair Croft at the Diogenes Club in St. James's until 11:30. The silence in the room was absolute. I did the mental calculation rapidly. But Holmes, I stammered. That is impossible. To get from St. James's to Fleet Street on a clear day is a 30-minute journey by cab. In this fog, it would take an hour at minimum. He could not possibly have left his club at 11:30 and died in Pentecost Alley before midnight. Holmes sprang from his chair, his face alight with intellectual ecstasy. The boredom of the week evaporated like mist in the morning sun. "Magnificent!" he cried, clapping his hands together. "A man who travels faster than the fog allows, dies without being killed, and is robbed without being looted. Lestrade, you have outdone yourself. This is not merely a crime, it is a spatial anomaly." He rushed to the hallway and threw on his Inverness cape. The hansom was waiting at the curb, its lamps glowing like the eyes of some prehistoric beast through the swirling yellow vapour. As we clambered in, the driver's face was entirely obscured by his muffler and the brim of his hat, and the vehicle pulled away into the gloom with a jerk that sent us reeling against the leather cushions. Holmes sat in total silence, his chin sunk upon his breast, a position I knew better than to disturb. He was already weaving the few strands of information Lestrade had provided into a preliminary tapestry of logic. For my part, I turned the problem over and over in my mind. The Diogenes Club, that most unsociable of institutions where Holmes's brother Mycroft was a permanent fixture, sat in the very heart of the West End. Pentecost Alley was a scab on the skin of the city, miles to the east. In a clear midday, the journey was a challenge. In this London particular, it was a physical impossibility to traverse that distance in 30 minutes. When we reached the vicinity of Fleet Street, the fog seemed to thicken, tasting of sulphur and soot. We dismounted near the mouth of a narrow opening that appeared to be nothing more than a crack between 2 towering brick edifices. This was Pentecost Alley. 2 constables stood guard, their wet capes shimmering in the light of their bull's-eye lanterns. As we moved past them, the air grew stagnant, trapped by the high, windowless walls of the warehouses on either side. The ground beneath our feet was slick with a cocktail of mud, refuse, and the greasy condensation of the night. At the far end of the cul-de-sac, a single gas lamp flickered fitfully, casting long, dancing shadows. Beneath it lay the earthly remains of Alistair Croft. Even in that dismal light, The man's wealth was jarringly apparent. He was dressed in full evening attire, a crisp white shirt, a silk tie, and a heavy overcoat of the finest broadcloth. Beside him, the grime of the alley seemed even more repulsive. Holmes approached the body with a nimbleness that belied the damp conditions. He did not speak. He dropped to his knees, his magnifying glass already in hand, and began a transformation that never failed to fascinate me. His eyes became hard and bright, his movements rhythmic and certain. He was no longer a man, he was a clinical machine of perception. "Note the position of the limbs, Watson," he whispered, his breath a white plume in the cold air. "The body lies flat on the back, legs slightly parted, arms flung wide. It is the posture of a man who has fallen backward in a moment of extreme shock." "Lestrade mentioned the expression on his face," I said, leaning over. Even prepared as I was, I recoiled slightly. Croft's features were contorted into a mask of such visceral horror that it seemed his very soul had been wrenched from him. His eyes, staring fixedly at the grey void above, were dilated to their fullest extent. "Fear, certainly," Holmes murmured, moving his glass over the dead man's lapels. "But look here, Watson. What do you make of the footwear?" I directed my own gaze toward Croft's feet. He wore patent leather dancing shoes, polished to a high sheen. "They are remarkably clean, Holmes, especially considering he is lying in a veritable swamp of city filth." "Precisely. There is a light dusting of grey ash upon the soles, nothing more." Had he walked even 10 yards into this alley, the sides of those shoes would be caked in this black slime. He did not walk here, Watson. He was placed here, or, more accurately, he was dropped here. "Dropped?" Lestrade cried, coming up behind us. "From where, Mr. Holmes? There are no windows in these walls for 40 feet up, and the roof lines are sheer." Holmes ignored the question, his attention now fixed on the man's throat. He gently turned the head to one side. No marks of strangulation, no puncture wounds. And yet, he leaned closer, sniffing the air near the victim's mouth. The faint, unmistakable scent of bitter almonds, perhaps? No, it is more floral. Lilies? No, something more chemical. It is gone now. He rose suddenly and began a minute examination of the ground surrounding the body. While Lestrade and the constables watched with a mixture of boredom and skepticism, Holmes was on all fours, his nose inches from the cobblestones. He wandered 10 feet back toward the entrance, then returned, his brow furrowed. "Lestrade," Holmes said, standing up and brushing the knees of his trousers. "You mentioned a missing document case. Was there anything else unusual found on the person of the deceased?" "Think carefully." The inspector rummaged in his pocket and produced a small clear glass vial, no larger than a man's thumb. "Only this, sir. Found it tucked into his waistcoat pocket alongside the watch. It's empty, as you can see." Holmes took the vial, holding it up to the flickering gaslight. It was indeed empty, but a thin, oily film coated the interior. He uncorked it, took a cautious sniff, and his eyes widened for a fraction of a second. He did not share his discovery, however. Instead, he slipped the vial into his own pocket and turned his gaze to the towering wall of the warehouse to our right. "This is the Willoughby warehouse, is it not?" Holmes asked. "It is," Lestrade replied. "The firm of Croft & Willoughby uses it for the storage of industrial equipment." "Why do you ask?" "Because," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrant tone, "the mystery of how a man travels 3 miles in 30 minutes is secondary to the mystery of why Alistair Croft, a man of impeccable character, should be carrying a concentrated solution of anhydrous chloral hydrate, a sedative powerful enough to fell an ox, while attending a friendly game of whist at the Diogenes Club." He looked at me, a grim smile playing on his lips. "The plot thickens, Watson. We are not merely looking at a murder. We are looking at a carefully choreographed performance, and if I am not mistaken, the next act has already begun." Lestrade remained with his constables to supervise the grim task of removing the remains of Mr. Alistair Croft, while Holmes and I hailed a second hansom to make the arduous journey back toward the West End. The fog had, if anything, become more claustrophobic, pressing against the glass windows of our cab like a living thing. Inside, the small lamp rattled in its bracket, casting fitful shadows across Holmes's lean, hawkish profile. He sat with his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on some point far beyond the wooden panels of the carriage. "You are unusually silent, Holmes," I remarked, as we passed the spectral outlines of the law courts. "I am balancing probabilities, Watson," he replied, his voice vibrating with a suppressed energy. "In the ordinary course of events, we are faced with a man who was in two places at once, or nearly so. The Bishop of Hereford and two justices of the Queen's Bench are not the sort of men to be mistaken about the time, nor are they prone to collective hallucinations. If they say Alistair Croft was at the Diogenes Club at 11:30, then the Alistair Croft of the Diogenes Club was indeed there. But the body, Holmes, it was warm. The constable saw the alley empty at 11. It is a physical impossibility for a man to traverse 3 miles of London fog in 25 minutes when even the stoutest horse can barely manage a crawl. Precisely. Therefore, one of our premises must be false. Either it was not Alistair Croft at the club, or the body in the alley was not Alistair Croft, which we know to be untrue, given Lestrade's identification, or, and this is the most intriguing possibility, the man did not travel by conventional means. "You mean he was carried?" "Or he was already there," Holmes murmured almost to himself. "But the clean shoes, Watson, the clean shoes are the pivot upon which this entire case turns. They tell us he did not walk into that alley. He was delivered to it as one delivers a parcel, and the vial of chloral hydrate. Why would a man of his standing carry a potent sedative? Was he the predator or the prey?" We reached the Diogenes Club in St. James's just as the clocks of the city were chiming one. It is the most singular establishment in London, a place where the members are discouraged from any form of social intercourse. To speak in the club is a high offence, and it was into the strangers' room, the only place where conversation is permitted, that we were ushered. The 3 witnesses were waiting for us, looking profoundly shaken. The Bishop of Hereford, a man of imposing stature with a silver mane of hair, sat flanked by Justice Sir James Saunders and Mr. Baron Dowse. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of old leather and tobacco, yet even here the silence of the rest of the club seemed to seep through the walls. "A terrible business, Mr. Holmes," the bishop said, his voice trembling slightly. "Alistair was a dear friend. We have shared a whist table every Thursday for a decade. I appreciate your seeing us at this hour," Holmes said, his manner surprisingly gentle. "I must ask you to be very precise. You are certain it was Mr. Croft who sat with you tonight?" "As certain as I am of my own name," Sir James interjected sharply. He sat 3 feet from me. We spoke of the recent fluctuations in the gold market. He was his usual self, though perhaps a trifle more preoccupied than is his wont. "In what way?" Holmes asked, his eyes narrowing. "He checked his watch repeatedly," Mr. Baron Dowse added, "and he seemed to be listening, not to our conversation, but for something outside. He also complained of a slight chill, despite the fire being quite robust. And the time of his departure? 11:30 precisely," the bishop stated firmly. "The hall porter, Jenkins, helped him into his overcoat and opened the door for him. He remarked that he had a carriage waiting, though Jenkins did not see it through the fog." Holmes rose and began to pace the small room, his eyes scanning the furniture. Suddenly, he stopped by the chair where Croft had sat. He bent down, peering at the dark velvet upholstery. With a swift movement, he produced a pair of tweezers from his pocket and extracted a tiny, shimmering object from the crevice of the seat. "Aha!" he whispered. "What have we here?" He held the tweezers up to the light. It was a small, translucent scale, no larger than a fingernail, with a faint iridescent sheen. To my eyes, it looked like nothing more than a bit of fish skin, or perhaps a piece of theatrical sequin. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. "A clue, Watson, that suggests our bullion broker had interests far removed from the city." "Tell me, Your Grace," he addressed the bishop, "did Mr. Croft receive any messages during the course of the evening?" The bishop hesitated. "Only one. A small note delivered by a commissionaire shortly after we began our second rubber. He read it, turned quite pale, and thrust it into his pocket. He said it was a matter of business, but his hand shook as he took up his cards." "Did he happen to leave that note behind?" "I believe he placed it in his leather document case," Sir James replied. "The very case that the inspector says is missing." Holmes's face darkened. "The case is gone, the note is gone, and the man is gone. But he left us a vial, a scent of flowers, and a fish scale." He turned to the door, his movements quick and decisive. "Come, Watson, we must find the porter, Jenkins. I have a suspicion that the waiting carriage was not a carriage at all." As we stepped back into the freezing night, Holmes turned to me, his face a mask of intense concentration. "The Diogenes Club is a sanctuary of silence, Watson, but tonight it has spoken volumes. We are dealing with a man who was terrified not of death, but of a specific appointment. He prepared himself with a sedative, not for himself, but perhaps for another, yet he was the one who succumbed. We must find where Alistair Croft spent those missing 30 minutes, for I am convinced he never left the vicinity of Fleet Street until the very moment he died." "But the witnesses saw him here," I cried. "They saw a man, Watson. Whether that man was Alistair Croft or a masterpiece of deception is a question that may lead us to the very heart of this labyrinth." We found Jenkins, the hall porter, in the small, glass-fronted cubicle that guarded the entrance to the Diogenes Club. He was a man whose skin appeared to have the texture of old parchment, his eyes clouded by years of observing the silent transitions of London's most reclusive gentlemen. He stood as we approached, his posture straightening into a practiced military stiffness. "Jenkins," Holmes began, his voice cutting through the heavy stillness of the hall, "you assisted Mr. Alistair Croft with his coat at 11:30. Tell me, did you observe anything unusual about his person or his departure?" The porter blinked slowly, his mind retreating to the moment. "He was in a great hurry, Mr. Holmes. Most unusual for Mr. Croft. He was, a man of very measured movements. But tonight, he was fumbling with his scarf. He kept his chin tucked low, as if the draught from the door were too much for him. Did he speak? Only to say that his carriage was waiting. I offered to whistle for a hansom, as the fog was so thick I could not see the curb, but he waved me off. He said, 'It is already here, Jenkins, the black brougham.'" "The black brougham," Holmes repeated, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "And did you hear this carriage?" "I heard the rattle of wheels, sir, and the clip-clop of a single horse. But it sounded muffled, not like the sharp strike of iron on stone. It was a duller sound, as if the hooves were shod in rubber, or the street was lined with straw." Holmes's hand shot out, gripping my arm with sudden intensity. Rubber-shod hooves, a luxury of the highest order, or a necessity for the utmost silence. "Thank you, Jenkins. You have been most observant." We stepped out onto the portico. The fog was a wall of cold, damp wool. Holmes did not immediately head for the street. Instead, he knelt on the very edge of the stone steps, shielding a match with his hands. He examined the area where a carriage would have pulled up. "Look here, Watson," he said, pointing to a faint, dark smear on the damp pavement. "Oil. Not the heavy grease of a common cab, but a fine aromatic oil used for the lubrication of precision hinges. And here—" He picked up a small, jagged splinter of wood. It was painted a deep, lustrous scarlet, a fragment of a carriage panel freshly chipped. "Our black brougham may be black on the outside, but it carries a secret of red beneath its skin." "A theatrical carriage?" I suggested, remembering the scale Holmes had found. "Perhaps, or a carriage that has been hastily repainted to avoid detection. But our immediate path leads not to the theatre, but to the partner. We must speak with Mr. Julian Willoughby. If the firm's warehouse is the site of the body's discovery, the surviving partner must have some light to shed on the matter. We found the Willoughby residence in a quiet, affluent square near Marylebone. Despite the hour, the house was ablaze with lights. We were shown into a study lined with heavy oak shelves, where a man of middle age paced the floor with frantic strides. This was Julian Willoughby. He was a stark contrast to the descriptions of the steady, stoic Croft. Willoughby was thin, with nervous, twitching hands and eyes that darted toward the door at every sound. Inspector Lestrade sent word. Willoughby cried before we could even introduce ourselves. "It is monstrous. Alistair murdered. And in Pentecost Alley, of all places. What could he have been doing there?" "That is precisely what we hoped you might tell us, Mr. Willoughby," Holmes said, his eyes roaming the room, taking in the spilled ink on the desk and the half-empty decanter of sherry. "You were his partner for 20 years. Was there any reason for him to visit your warehouse in the middle of the night?" "None at all," Willoughby exclaimed. "We deal in bullion, Mr. Holmes, gold and silver bars. The warehouse in Pentecost Alley is used for the storage of the heavy iron crates and the smelting equipment. It is a fortress of stone and steel. There is no reason for Alistair to be there unless he was lured. He received a note tonight," I added. "At the Diogenes Club." Willoughby's face went ash-pale. He sank into a chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "The note. It has started, then. I told him we could not keep the secret forever." "What secret, Mr. Willoughby?" Holmes's voice was like a velvet trap. "The Icarus shipment," Willoughby whispered. "A month ago, a significant quantity of industrial gold disappeared from our records. Alistair insisted it was a clerical error, but I suspected theft. He told me he was conducting a private investigation to save the firm's reputation. He said he had a lead on a man known only as the Mime, a master of disguises who had been seen lurking near the docks." "The Mime?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "A shadow doctor, a man who supposedly has no face of his own. Alistair was obsessed. He thought he could trap him. That vial you found, Alistair told me he would use it if he ever caught the man, to keep him quiet until the police arrived." Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the fog-streaked glass. A master of disguises, a missing shipment of gold, and a partner who seems more terrified than grieved. "Tell me, Mr. Willoughby, how did you spend your evening?" "I was here, alone. My servants can attest that I have not left this study since 7 o'clock. "And the scratch on your right palm?" Holmes asked, turning sharply. "The one that is still seeping a small amount of blood onto your cuff?" Willoughby looked down at his hand as if he had never seen it before. I broke a glass. A mere accident, an accident that seems to have left a trace of scarlet paint under your fingernail," Holmes remarked coldly. He turned to me. "Come, Watson. Mr. Willoughby requires time to recover his composure. We have a carriage to find, and I believe I know exactly where a black brougham with red bones might be hidden." As we descended the stairs, Holmes whispered to me, "The man is lying, Watson. He didn't break a glass. He was climbing. But the question is, was he climbing into a window or out of a conspiracy?" The night air was like a wet shroud as we left the affluent quiet of Marylebone behind. Holmes, despite the hour and the damp, seemed invigorated, his long strides forcing me into a brisk trot to keep pace. He did not immediately signal for a hansom, but instead walked with his nose tilted slightly upward, sniffing the air with the discernment of a hound. "The oil, Watson," he said, as we turned into a labyrinth of narrow streets leading back toward the river. "That aromatic lubricant I noted on the club's portico is a very specific compound, huile de mécanique, produced only by a small firm in Lyons and imported by a single carriage builder in Southwark. It is designed for the high-precision axles of vehicles intended for near-silent movement. Combine that with the scent of wintergreen I detected, and our trail is as clear as if it were marked in chalk. But in this fog, Holmes, it seems an impossible feat. Not impossible, merely difficult. The heavy vapor traps the scent in the lower strata of the air. It is particularly pungent near the mouths of these mews. We spent the next hour in a grueling circuit of the coach houses and livery stables that serviced the fringes of the city. At each stop, Holmes would linger by the entrance, his bull's-eye lantern casting a narrow, intense beam over the cobblestones. It was near the docks of Upper Thames Street, in a derelict mews that smelled of rotting hay and brackish water, that he finally stopped. "Observe, Watson," he whispered, gesturing to the heavy wooden doors of a detached stable-house. The doors were slightly ajar, and on the threshold lay a fresh smear of that same dark aromatic oil. But more telling was the faint, jagged line of scarlet paint that had been scraped against the doorframe, a perfect match for the splinter Holmes had found earlier. With a finger to his lips, Holmes drew his revolver. I followed suit, my heart hammering against my ribs. We slipped inside. The interior was cavernous and cold, lit only by the grey light filtering through a cracked skylight. In the center of the floor stood the black brougham. Even in the gloom, it was an imposing sight, sleek, windowless, and coated in a layer of soot and fog. Holmes approached the vehicle with predatory grace. He ran his hand along the side panel, and when he withdrew it, his fingers were stained black. He held them up to his nose. "Lamp-black and tallow," he muttered. "A temporary coating. Beneath this grime, I suspect we shall find the scarlet livery of a very different sort of owner." He stepped to the rear of the carriage and swung open the door. I expected to see the plush interior of a gentleman's transport. Instead, I gasped at the sight that met us. The inside of the carriage had been transformed into a mobile dressing room. A large triptych mirror was bolted to the far wall, flanked by several small oil lamps that were still warm to the touch. Trays of grease paint, spirit gum, and various powders were scattered across the seats. "The mime's laboratory," Holmes whispered, his lantern illuminating a row of wigs hanging from the luggage racks. He reached into the corner and pulled out a heap of discarded clothing. It was a suit of fine evening wear, identical in every detail to the one Alistair Croft had been wearing when he died. Beside it lay a prosthetic mask made of thin, cured leather, painted with such exquisite skill that it mimicked the sagging jawline and heavy brow of the deceased bullion broker with haunting accuracy. "My word, Holmes," I exclaimed, "it was an impersonation. The man at the Diogenes Club was not Croft at all." "Exactly, Watson. While the real Alistair Croft was being held, or perhaps already murdered, elsewhere, a double took his place at the whist table. It provided the perfect alibi for the victim's time of death, while ensuring that his disappearance would not be noted until it was far too late." Holmes began to sift through the theatrical debris with feverish intensity. Suddenly, he let out a sharp cry of triumph. From beneath the driver's seat, he withdrew a heavy, leather-bound document case. Gold lettering on the flap read, "A. Croft, Private." "The missing case," I cried. "Locked, of course," Holmes said, deftly applying a small metal pick to the mechanism. The lock clicked open, and he spread the contents across the floor of the carriage. There were ledgers, maps of the London docks, and several private letters, but it was a small, hand-drawn diagram that commanded Holmes's attention. It depicted the interior of the Willoughby warehouse in Pentecost Alley with a specific floorboard in the smelting room circled in red. "But look at this, Holmes," I said, pointing to the floor of the carriage. Near the dressing table lay a single discarded glove. It was not a gentleman's kid glove, but a heavy gauntlet-style glove of the kind used by blacksmiths, or those who handle caustic chemicals. On the palm of the glove was a fresh, dark stain that looked like blood, and stuck to the leather was another of those iridescent scales. Holmes picked up the scale and held it close to the lantern. His expression, usually so impassive, shifted into one of profound concern. "This is no fish scale, Watson," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It is a flake of dried mica, heavily impregnated with a particular variety of phosphorus. It is used in the manufacture of high-temperature crucibles for the purification of gold, and this blood—" He touched the stain and then his own tongue, a habit that always made me shudder. "It is not human, Watson, it is bovine. We are dealing with a man who has been working in a slaughterhouse, or a place that uses blood as a clarifying agent in industrial processes." He stood up, his eyes flashing. "We have the method, Watson, and we have the means. But we are still missing the why. Why would Julian Willoughby, a man of wealth, conspire with a theatrical assassin to murder his own partner? And why leave the body in the very place the diagram suggests a secret is hidden?" A sudden, sharp metallic clang echoed through the coach house, followed by the heavy thud of the main doors being slammed shut and bolted from the outside. "Holmes!" I shouted, as the smell of burning pitch began to waft through the cracks in the floorboards. "The trap is sprung, Watson," Holmes cried, rushing toward the carriage door. "And it seems the mime has decided to provide us with a final, fiery performance." The thick, oily smoke from the burning pitch began to coil like serpents around the wheels of the brougham, filling the coach house with a suffocating, blinding haze. Through the grey-black swirls, I could see the orange flicker of flames licking at the dry timber of the walls. Panic, sharp and cold, gripped my chest, but Holmes remained a statue of icy deliberation. He did not rush for the bolted doors. Instead, he lunged back into the carriage, his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon amidst the theatrical clutter. "The mirrors, Watson! Help me with the mirrors!" he shouted above the crackle of the fire. I obeyed without comprehension, wrenching the heavy triptych glass from its mountings. Holmes grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the carriage's tool chest and gestured toward the rear wall of the stable, a section where the brickwork appeared dampened by an external leak. With a strength born of desperation, he drove the bar into the mortar, while I used the heavy frame of the mirror as a makeshift shield against the encroaching heat. "The structure is aged, the lime mortar decayed by the river air," Holmes gasped, his face blackened by soot. "One more heave, Watson. Together!" With a sickening groan of masonry, a section of the wall gave way, collapsing outward into a narrow, muddy gutter. We tumbled through the gap, gasping for the freezing, fog-laden air of the London night just as the roof of the coach house fell in with a roar of sparks. We lay for a moment in the filth, the heat of the conflagration still scorching our backs, until Holmes scrambled to his feet. He did not look back at the destruction. His eyes were fixed on the document case, which he had managed to shield with his own body. "Are you harmed, Holmes?" I asked, wiping the grime from my brow. He did not answer. He began to pace the narrow gutter, his movements jerky and erratic. He was muttering to himself, a low, rapid-fire monologue that I could only partially catch. "Icarus, the wax and the feathers, the sun is the furnace. Of course. How could I have been so blind? It is not the gold that is missing, Watson. It is the weight." "The weight?" I asked, struggling to keep up, as he suddenly set off at a break-long pace back toward the main thoroughfare. "The density of bullion, man. If one removes 10% of the gold and replaces it with a lead-bismuth alloy, the weight remains constant, but the value is gutted. But to do so, one needs a catalyst, a way to bind the metals without the telltale discoloration. The phosphorus, the mica." He stopped abruptly under a gas lamp, his eyes glittering with a feverish light that bordered on the manic. He looked less like a detective and more like the very mime we were hunting. "We must get to the warehouse, Watson, now, before the second act is concluded." "But the police, Holmes? Surely we should summon Lestrade?" "Lestrade is a good man in a chase, but he would stomp through this mystery like a buffalo in a porcelain shop," Holmes snapped. He hailed a passing hansom with a piercing whistle that seemed to shatter the fog. "To Pentecost Alley, and drive as if the devil himself were on your box." As we rattled through the streets, Holmes's behavior grew even more singular. He began to strip off his soot-stained Inverness cape, turning it inside out to reveal a dull, ragged lining. He rummaged in his pockets, producing a lump of grease paint and a tattered cap. Within minutes, the sharp-featured gentleman of Baker Street had vanished. In his place sat a slouching, disreputable dock worker, his face smeared with grime and his eyes clouded with a simulated alcoholic stupor. "You intend to go in disguise?" I whispered. "I intend to see what Alistair Croft saw before he was silenced," Holmes replied, his voice now a coarse Cockney rasp. "The Icarus shipment was never stolen, Watson. It was being transformed. And Julian Willoughby was not the mastermind. He was the victim of a blackmail so potent it drove him to complicity. Look at the map again." He thrust the diagram from Croft's case under my nose. I saw now that the red circle over the floorboard was not merely a hiding place. It was positioned directly over the main gas feeder line for the smelting furnace. "The scent of flowers I smelled on the body," Holmes murmured, his gaze distant. "It wasn't lilies. It was le baiser de la mort, the kiss of death, a rare volatile compound used in the French theatre to create sudden dramatic clouds of vapor. In high concentrations it acts as a paralytic. Croft wasn't murdered by a blade or a bullet. He was stood over that vent and the gas was released. He died staring at the man he thought was his friend, unable to move a muscle as the life was drawn from him. And the double at the club? A necessary diversion to ensure the accident occurred while Croft was officially elsewhere. But the mime grew greedy. He kept the document case. He kept the secrets. The hansom slowed as we approached the darkened mouth of Pentecost Alley. The fog here was so thick it felt like wading through water. Holmes slipped from the cab before it had even come to a full halt, melting into the shadows with the silence of a phantom. I followed, my hand on the butt of my service revolver. The warehouse loomed before us, a silent monolith of stone. But as we neared the heavy iron doors, a light flickered from within, not the steady glow of a lamp, but the fierce pulsing radiance of a furnace stoked to white heat. And then, through the heavy silence of the alley, came a sound that chilled me to the bone, the sound of a man laughing, a high melodic trill that sounded more like a song than a vent of mirth. "The furnace is lit, Watson," Holmes whispered, his disguise making him look like a demon in the shadows. "The evidence of the counterfeit is being melted down. We are just in time for the final smelting." We did not approach the main iron doors, which Holmes whispered were likely barred from within to withstand a siege. Instead, he led me down a narrow, filth-choked gap between the Willoughby warehouse and its neighbour, where the heat from the internal furnace began to radiate through the thick brickwork. High above, a small soot-grimed transom window stood slightly ajar, a ventilation necessity for the smelting process. With a strength that always surprised me in so lean a frame, Holmes braced himself against the opposite wall and hoisted me toward the opening, before scrambling up with the agility of a mountain cat. We found ourselves perched upon a narrow iron catwalk, shrouded in the darkness of the rafters. Below us, the warehouse opened into a vast, subterranean chamber dominated by a roaring coke-fired furnace. The air was a shimmering haze of heat and chemical fumes, smelling sharply of the phosphorus Holmes had predicted. In the center of this industrial hell stood a figure that seemed born of the flames themselves. He was a man of middle height, but he moved with a fluid, exaggerated grace that was profoundly unsettling. He wore a heavy leather apron over charcoal-grey clothes, and his face, if it could be called that, was a featureless mask of pale silk, save for two jagged slits for eyes. This was the mime, and as he moved between the cooling trays and the furnace, he hummed a low, melodic air from a popular French operetta. Near him, cowering on a wooden crate, was Julian Willoughby. The partner's face was a map of terror, his eyes fixed on the furnace with the hypnotic stare of a rabbit before a cobra. "Faster, Mr. Willoughby," the mime called out, his voice a rich, cultivated baritone that echoed strangely in the hollow space. "The dawn approaches, and with it, the delivery of the Icarus bars to the Bank of England. We would not want our esteemed patrons to find the gold wanting." "You killed Alistair," Willoughby choked out, his voice cracking. "You used the vent. I saw the vapor. Mr. Croft was an obstacle to progress," the mime replied, pausing to stir a bubbling crucible with a long iron rod. A shower of iridescent sparks, the mica flakes Holmes had identified, erupted into the air. He possessed a stubborn, old-fashioned belief in the purity of the metal. "You, Julian, are more pragmatic. You understand that in the modern world, the appearance of wealth is far more valuable than the wealth itself." He lifted a heavy pig of lead bismuth alloy and slid it into the molten gold. I felt Holmes's hand tighten my shoulder. Through the shimmering heat, I saw the mime reach for a large glass carboy containing a dark, viscous liquid. "The stabilizing agent," Holmes hissed in my ear, his voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. "The bovine blood. He is using the organic proteins to prevent the bismuth from crystallizing. It is a masterpiece of illicit metallurgy." The mime began to pour the liquid into the vat, and a thick, sweetish stench rose to the rafters, mingling with the acrid bite of the phosphorus. It was then that I noticed the second crime. Stacked against the far wall were several dozen heavy wooden crates, already stamped with the official seal of Croft and Willoughby. But these were not filled with gold. They were being packed with the document cases and private ledgers of half the merchant banks in the city. "He isn't just adulterating the gold, Watson," Holmes whispered, his eyes scanning the room with clinical intensity. "He is using the confusion of the Icarus shipment to mask a systematic looting of his client's most sensitive records. Blackmail on a scale that could topple the government." Suddenly, the mime stopped. He did not look up, but he tilted his head as if listening to a sound beyond the roar of the furnace. "We have guests, Julian," he said softly. "The air in the rafters has grown heavy with the scent of Baker Street and the army." Before I could reach for my revolver, the mime reached for a lever mounted on the wall. A sharp hiss, like the strike of 1,000 cobras, filled the warehouse. "The gas!" I cried, remembering Holmes's description of the kiss of death. "Not the gas, Watson, the vents!" Holmes shouted. With a thunderous crash, the iron shutters of the transom windows slammed shut, and a section of the catwalk beneath our feet gave way. We plummeted toward the stone floor, landing amidst a pile of empty crates. The mime turned toward us, a gleaming casting ladle full of white-hot metal held in his hand like a weapon. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the mime said, his voice dripping with theatrical mockery. "I had expected you at the coach house. You are a remarkably difficult man to incinerate." Holmes stood up, shedding his dockworker's cap and straightening his spine. Despite the soot and the fall, he possessed an aura of absolute command. "The coach house was a clumsy diversion, monsieur," Holmes said, his voice ringing through the chamber, "as was the masquerade at the Diogenes Club. You are talented, I grant you, but you have made the fatal error of the performer. You have stayed on stage too long." The mime laughed, that high, trilling sound we had heard from the alley. "On the contrary, Mr. Holmes, the curtain is only just rising. And for my next trick, I shall make the world's greatest detective disappear into a vat of 22-carat bismuth." He stepped forward, the molten metal sloshing in the ladle, but Holmes did not flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced the small, empty vial Lestrade had found on Croft's body. "Alistair Croft was a brave man," Holmes said coolly. "He knew he was walking into a trap, and he left me the one thing you overlooked, the signature of the man who sold you the chloral hydrate." The mime froze, the silk of his mask fluttering with his breath. For the first time, the arrogance in his posture flickered. The mime stood frozen, the heavy ladle trembling slightly in his grip. The orange glow of the furnace played across the silk of his mask, making the jagged eye slits appear to pulse with a life of their own. For a long, breathless moment, the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the fire and the distant, wet slap of the river against the warehouse pilings. "A signature?" the mime said, his voice regaining its melodic, mocking edge. "You dally with trifles, Mr. Holmes. A glass vial is a common thing, as easily found in a Whitechapel gutter as in a Harley Street surgery. Common perhaps to the unobservant eye, Holmes countered, taking a slow, measured step to the left, drawing the mime's attention away from where I stood near the stacks of stolen records. But this vial bears the hallmark of a very specific apothecary in the Rue de la Paix. It is a vessel designed for high-end theatrical perfumes, repurposed for a far more sinister chemistry. And while you were diligent in scrubbing your identity from the streets of London, you forgot that spirit gum, once dried, retains the microscopic ridges of the hand that applied it. When I recovered this from the inspector, I found a thumbprint etched in the residue of the adhesive you used to secure your mask at the Diogenes Club. The mime's laugh was shorter this time, more of a jagged bark. A thumbprint. You expect me to believe you have matched a smudge of glue to a man who has no face? I matched it to a man who has many, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a whip crack of authority. A man whose career began in the chemistry labs of the Paris Mint before a penchant for the dramatic led him to the stage of the Grand Guignol. You are Pierre Laroche, are you not? Or perhaps you prefer your stage name, the Architect of Shadows. It was your knowledge of gold purification that allowed you to conceive the Icarus deception, and your theatrical brilliance that allowed you to walk into the most exclusive club in London as Alistair Croft. At the mention of his name, the mime, Laroche, stiffened. With a sudden, violent motion, he hurled the ladle. It hissed through the air, a comet of white-hot death. Holmes ducked with the fluidity of a fencer, the molten metal splattering against a stack of crates behind him, which instantly erupted into flames. "Watson, the valve!" Holmes cried. I did not hesitate. I lunged for the heavy iron wheel I had seen earlier near the smelting floor, the one Holmes had indicated was linked to the main gas feeder. Laroche saw my intent and reached into the folds of his leather apron, withdrawing a long, slender blade that shimmered with a pale, bluish tint. Poison, no doubt. He moved toward me with terrifying speed, his movements no longer human but those of a predatory insect. "Stop him, Julian," Laroche commanded. Willoughby, spurred by a sudden, desperate realization that his only hope for mercy lay with us, threw himself at the mime's legs. The two men went down in a heap of tangled limbs and leather. It was the diversion I needed. I gripped the iron wheel and heaved. It resisted at first, rusted by the damp river air, but with a grunt of exertion, I felt the mechanism give way. A high-pitched scream of escaping gas filled the chamber, but it did not come from the furnace. Holmes had not directed me to the fuel line, but to the emergency suppression system, a series of overhead pipes designed to flood the smelting floor with carbon dioxide in the event of a breach. A thick white fog, far denser and colder than the yellow pea souper outside, began to pour from the rafters. It rolled across the floor in a heavy wave, extinguishing the smaller fires and shrouding the combatants in an impenetrable veil. "The mask, Watson! Your handkerchief!" Holmes shouted. I pressed my cloth to my face, dropping to one knee as the oxygen was displaced. Through the swirling white mist, I saw Holmes move. He did not run, he seemed to glide, guided by a sensory map of the warehouse he had memorized from the diagram in Croft's case. I heard the sound of a sharp struggle, the muffled thud of a blow and the clatter of steel on stone. "The game is over, Laroche!" Holmes's voice rang out from the heart of the fog. "The yard is already at the gates. I took the liberty of sending a telegram from the station near Marylebone before we hailed our last cab. Lestrade may be slow, but he is punctual when a bullion thief is the prize." As if on cue, the heavy iron doors of the warehouse shivered under a massive impact. The sound of wood on metal, a police ram, echoed through the vaulted space. The white fog began to clear, drawn out by the ventilation fans Holmes had reactivated with a flick of a lever. As the air thinned, a singular sight was revealed. Julian Willoughby lay gasping for air near the furnace, shaken but alive. In the center of the floor, Sherlock Holmes stood tall, his foot planted firmly on the wrist of the man in the silk mask. Laroche was pinned, his poisoned blade lying yards away. But it was Holmes's expression that struck me most. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a cold, burning curiosity. He reached down and, with a swift movement, tore the silk mask from the prisoner's face. I gasped. Beneath the mask was not the scarred or monstrous visage I had expected. It was a face of haunting, aristocratic beauty, pale and composed even in defeat. But the man's eyes were not fixed on Holmes. They were fixed on the document cases stacked against the wall. "You have the gold, detective," Laroche whispered, a thin trail of blood trickling from his lip. "But you have no idea what you have truly found in those boxes. The Icarus was never the goal. It was the lure." Holmes's brow furrowed. He reached for the nearest crate, prying the lid open with his bare hands. Inside, tucked between the ledgers, was a single, heavy cylinder of lead, sealed with the wax of the British Admiralty. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice turning deathly quiet as he stared at the seal, "we must get these records to Baker Street immediately. The murder of Alistair Croft was not a crime of greed. It was a prologue to treason." The heavy iron doors of the warehouse finally groaned and buckled, swinging inward with a discordant shriek of tortured metal. Inspector Lestrade, followed by a phalanx of blue-coated constables with lanterns held high, burst into the chamber. They were met by the surreal sight of the dissipating white fog and Sherlock Holmes, still soot-streaked and dishevelled, standing triumphantly over the unmasked Pierre Laroche. The inspector's jaw dropped as he took in the roaring furnace, the stacks of crates and the aristocratic features of the prisoner. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade gasped, his eyes darting from the captive to the glowing vats of metal. "We received your wire, but I had no idea." "Is this the man? Is this Croft's killer?" "It is, Lestrade," Holmes replied, his voice regaining its usual cool, clipped tone. "Though I suspect he has many names. You will find Mr. Julian Willoughby over by the ventilation controls. He is a secondary player in this drama, though his cooperation will be vital for your prosecution. Secure the prisoner, if you please. He is as slippery as a Thames eel and twice as venomous." As the constables moved to handcuff Laroche and assist the trembling Willoughby, Holmes turned his back on the official investigation. He beckoned to me, his eyes fixed on the leaden cylinder he had pulled from the crate. With a surreptitious movement, he draped his discarded inside-out cape over the object, shielding it from the inspector's curious gaze. "Watson," he whispered, "we must leave. Lestrade has his men and his suspects. He will spend the next 3 hours cataloguing gold bars that are only half gold, but the true heart of this mystery lies within this lead sleeve. We must get back to Baker Street before the sun rises." We slipped away through the chaos of the arrest, our exit masked by the fog that still clung stubbornly to Pentecost Alley. The return journey in a hansom was a blur of grey shadows, and the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves. Holmes sat with a heavy cylinder across his knees, his fingers tracing the intricate wax seal of the Admiralty. He did not speak a word until we were back in the familiar sanctuary of our sitting room, where the fire had burned down to a dull orange glow. Without pausing to remove his grime-caked boots, Holmes moved to his chemical table. He lit a spirit lamp and carefully warmed a thin spatula. "The seal is genuine, Watson," he murmured, his exhaustion seemingly forgotten. "But note the weight. I remarked earlier that density is the pivot of this case. This cylinder is composed of lead, yet it is significantly lighter than its volume should allow. With the surgical precision I had witnessed so many times before, he worked the spatula under the edge of the wax, lifting the Admiralty seal without breaking the impression. He then unscrewed the lead cap. I leaned forward, expecting to see rolled parchments or perhaps a list of naval codes. Instead, Holmes reached inside and withdrew a second, smaller cylinder made of gleaming, non-corrosive silver. "A nesting doll of secrets," I remarked. "More than that," Holmes replied, unscrewing the silver cap. From within, he extracted a single heavily encrypted document and a set of photographic negatives. He held the negatives up to the light of the spirit lamp. My breath caught in my throat. They were technical drawings, intricate skeletal designs for a new class of submersible vessel, marked with the secret insignia of the British Naval Intelligence. "Good heavens, Holmes," I cried. "These are the plans for the experimental Icarus torpedo launchers. If these fell into the hands of a foreign power, the balance of naval power in the Channel would be shattered," Holmes finished grimly. "Now do you see, Watson? The bullion brokerage of Croft and Willoughby was merely a conduit. The firm held the private accounts and security boxes of several high-ranking Admiralty officials. Alistair Croft discovered that his partner was being blackmailed by Laroche, not for money, but for access. Laroche, under the guise of the mime, was systematically replacing the firm's gold with his bismuth alloy to create a financial scandal that would mask his true objective, the theft of these designs. "But why leave the body in the warehouse?" I asked, struggling to grasp the complexity of the plot. A final misdirection. By placing Croft's body at the scene of the gold theft, Laroche ensured that any investigation would be handled by the City Police and Scotland Yard as a matter of murder and robbery. He never intended for anyone to look deeper into the document crates. He was hours away from shipping these negatives to the continent under the cover of industrial records from the smelting room. Holmes began to pace the room, his eyes dark with a sudden, sharp realization. "But there is an inconsistency, Watson, a flaw in the mime's performance that I only now perceive. If Laroche was working for a foreign power, why the theatricality? Why the masquerade at the Diogenes Club? A simple assassination would have sufficed." He stopped at the window, staring out at the first pale streaks of dawn. "Unless—" The man at the club was not there to provide an alibi. He was there to deliver a message to someone else, someone who was sitting at that very whist table. I felt a cold shiver of apprehension. The bishop or one of the judges? "The bishop mentioned a note," Holmes whispered, his voice vibrating with a new intensity. "A note that Croft, or the man playing him, received and turned pale over." "Watson, we have captured the assassin, but the employer remains at large. And if I am right, the most dangerous part of this night is yet to begin." The sun had just begun to touch the soot-stained chimney pots of Baker Street, with a pale, sickly yellow light, when Holmes finally turned from the window. The fatigue of the night seemed to have vanished, replaced by that cold, grey-eyed intensity that always preceded his most daring maneuvers. He stood over the chemical table, his long, thin fingers dancing over the negatives of the torpedo designs. "It is a game of 3, Watson," he said, his voice as sharp as the morning air. "The bishop, the justice, and the baron, all men of impeccable standing, yet one of them is a Judas who has bartered the security of the empire for a mountain of adulterated gold. The note delivered at the Diogenes Club was not a warning to the mime, it was a receipt. Laroche, in the guise of Croft, received a confirmation that the Admiralty cylinders were ready for collection. The pallor the bishop observed was not fear, but the final flourish of a master actor signaling his co-conspirator that the exchange was in motion. "But which one, Holmes?" I asked, feeling the weight of the scandal that would follow such a revelation. "To accuse a man of that stature without proof—" "I do not intend to accuse, Watson. I intend to invite. In the world of high-stakes treason, greed is only surpassed by the fear of being overlooked." He sat at his desk and rapidly scrawled 3 identical notes. Each invited the recipient to a private viewing of "recovered personal effects of the late Mr. Croft" at Baker Street at 8 o'clock this morning. I have added a postscript to each, mentioning a certain silver nesting cylinder that I am sure will be of particular interest to the owner. He rang for the commissionaire and gave strict instructions for the delivery of the messages. Then he turned to me with a mischievous glint in his eye. "And now, Watson, we must prepare the stage. A transformation is required, not of ourselves, but of this room." For the next hour, Holmes was a whirlwind of activity. He moved the heavy lead cylinder to the center of the mahogany table, placing it directly under the light of the chandelier. He then took several bars of the adulterated bullion we had recovered from the warehouse and scattered them around it, creating a tableau of recovered treasure. But the pièce de résistance was a small, silver-plated cigar humidor which he placed slightly to the side, draped partially with a piece of Admiralty blue velvet. "The lure is set," he whispered, checking the time. "Now we wait. I shall be in the bedroom with the door slightly ajar. You, my dear Watson, shall be our master of ceremonies. You will receive them, offer them tea, and observe. Note every twitch of a finger, every glance toward that silver box. The man who cannot keep his eyes off the humidor is the man who believes the Icarus negatives are inside." As the clock struck 8, the first of our guests arrived. It was Mr. Baron Dowse, looking remarkably composed for a man who had spent the night in a police statement. He was followed minutes later by the Bishop of Hereford, whose silver hair seemed to shine with an inner light of righteousness. Finally, Justice Sir James Saunders entered, his legalistic face a mask of somber professional interest. I played my part as best I could, offering refreshments and making stilted conversation about the tragedy of poor Croft. The three men stood around the table, their gazes fixed on the leaden cylinder. The bishop spoke of the vanity of earthly riches, while the baron discussed the legal ramifications of the gold's recovery. Sir James remained largely silent, his eyes darting between the bullion and the velvet-draped silver box. "A remarkable recovery, Dr. Watson," Sir James finally said, his voice devoid of emotion. But the inspector mentioned a document case. "Were there other items, perhaps of a more sensitive nature?" "There were many things, Sir James," I replied, following Holmes's script. "Most are currently being catalogued by the Yard. However, Mr. Holmes felt that some items were too delicate for the common hands of the constabulary. That silver cylinder, for instance." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was as if a cold draught had blown through the cracks in the floorboards. Sir James took a half step toward the table, his hand hovering near the humidor. "A silver cylinder?" the bishop asked, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "I don't recall Alistair mentioning such a thing. It was found in the heart of the smelting furnace," I lied. Untouched by the flames, Sir James's breathing had become shallow. He looked at the bishop and the baron, a flicker of something, was it contempt, crossing his features. "Perhaps, Doctor, it would be best if I were to take custody of such a delicate item. Given my position on the Privy Council, I am well placed to ensure it reaches the proper authorities without public scrutiny." "I think not, Sir James," came a voice from the bedroom door. Holmes stepped into the room. He was no longer the soot-stained adventurer of the night, but the quintessential gentleman detective, his dressing gown flowing behind him like a robe of state. He walked to the table and picked up the silver humidor, flipping the lid open to reveal only a few dried tobacco leaves. "The proper authorities are already here," Holmes said, gesturing toward the window. Below in the street, I heard the rattle of a carriage and the sharp military command of an officer. Sir James Saunders went as white as the silk mask Laroche had worn. He reached into his coat, but Holmes was faster. With a movement so swift it was almost a blur, he pinned the justice's arm against the table. "A small tip, Sir James," Holmes whispered, his face inches from the traitor's. "When one is dealing in the secrets of the Admiralty, one should never leave a trail of wintergreen scent on a Diogenes Club message. It is a very distinctive fragrance, often used by those who suffer from the gout, a malady I noted you mentioned to the bishop only last week." The man collapsed into a chair, his legalistic mask shattered. The bishop and the baron stood in stunned silence as the door opened to reveal Lestrade and two plainclothes officers. "James," the bishop whispered, his voice breaking. "Why?" "Because the Empire is a dinosaur, Hereford," Saunders spat, his voice regaining a bitter strength, "and I chose to be with the mammals who will feast on its carcass. La Roche promised me a kingdom in the new order." "He promised you a gallows, Saunders," Holmes corrected coldly, "and I have made it my personal mission to ensure you do not miss your appointment." As the officers led the justice away, Holmes turned to the window, watching the carriage disappear into the morning mist. The tension in his shoulders seemed to bleed away, and for a moment he looked profoundly tired. "Well, Watson," he said, picking up his violin, "the Icarus has flown too close to the sun, and its wings of bismuth have melted. But I fear the scandal will outlive us both. What do you say to a late breakfast at Simpson's? I believe we have earned the right to a more palatable variety of gold, in the form of some well-buttered toast." The silence that followed, the departure of the police and the shocked bishop, was heavy with the weight of the night's revelations. The tray of tea sat cooling on the side table, forgotten amidst the debris of our investigation. Holmes had returned to his armchair, the violin nestled under his chin, though he did not draw the bow. Instead, he stared into the embers of the fire, his sharp features softened by the fatigue he so rarely admitted to. For my part, I found myself leaning against the mantelpiece, my mind still reeling from the image of a justice of the Queen's Bench being led away in irons. "It is the duality of man, Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "On one hand, we have Alistair Croft, a man of wealth who risked everything to protect his nation's secrets. On the other, Sir James Saunders, who sat in judgment of others while bartering away the very foundations of the law. One died in a gutter to save a secret, the other would have lived in a palace to sell it. But how, Holmes? I asked, finally sinking into my own chair. The density of the plot was as thick as the alloy in that warehouse. At what point did the threads truly come together for you? Holmes set the violin aside and leaned forward, his eyes regaining their analytical spark. The mystery was a tripartite structure, Watson. Each part required a different lens to see clearly. First, there was the chemical deception. He pointed to the lead cylinder on the table. The Icarus project was brilliantly named, for it relied on the heat of the furnace to hide its true nature. La Roche knew that to deceive a bullion broker, one cannot simply steal, one must substitute. By using a lead-bismuth alloy, he achieved a specific gravity that would pass a cursory inspection. He reached for a scrap of paper and scribbled a brief calculation. You see, the density of pure gold is approximately $19, 3 GCM $3. By combining lead, $11, 34 GCM $3, and bismuth, $9, 78 GCM $3. With a specific concentration of tungsten or depleted gold dust, a clever chemist can mimic the weight of a standard bar. The phosphorus and mica I found were the catalysts, the stabilizers that prevented the different metals from separating during the cooling process. And the second part? I prompted. The theatrical masquerade, Holmes continued, ticking the points off on his long, thin fingers. The mime was the only man capable of such a feat. The clue of the rubber-shod carriage was the beginning. It spoke of a need for silence, but also of a vehicle that had been repurposed. A black brougham with red bones, a theatrical transport painted for a night's work. When I found the dressing room within that carriage, the timeline at the Diogenes Club became a transparent ruse. La Roche did not need to travel from St. James's to Fleet Street. He only needed to appear at the club long enough to establish the alibi and receive the signal from Saunders. And that brings us to the third part, I said. The traitor himself. Precisely. The wintergreen was the final blow. It is a scent I noted on the note Croft, or rather La Roche, received. It is also the scent of methyl salicylate, the primary ingredient in the liniments used for gout. When Sir James mentioned his malady to the bishop earlier in the evening, the circle was closed, but I needed a way to force his hand. The silver humidor was a simple piece of stagecraft. A man who is guilty of treason will always see a threat in the smallest of hidden objects. He believed the negatives were in that box because his conscience, if he has one, could imagine no other outcome. The lead-bismuth alloy mimicked the weight of gold to hide the systematic looting of the firm's assets. The Admiralty seals, the true prize, which transformed a common robbery into an act of high-stakes espionage. The mime's mask, a masterpiece of deception that exploited the Diogenes Club's culture of silence. The wintergreen scent, a physiological tell that linked the high-ranking judge to the criminal underworld. Holmes rose and walked to the window, the morning sun finally burning through the last of the London fog. The streets below were beginning to wake, the milkman's cart rattling over the cobblestones. To the world outside it was merely another Thursday in January, yet the history of the nation had been redirected within these four walls. "You have saved the Admiralty, Holmes," I said with genuine admiration, "and perhaps averted a war." "I have merely solved a puzzle, Watson," he replied, a faint, melancholic smile playing on his lips. The Icarus was a flight of ambition that ended, as it always must, in a fall. But come, the fog has lifted, and my appetite has returned. Let us see if Mrs. Hudson can provide us with a breakfast that does not taste of sulphur and bismuth. After that, I believe there is a singular case of a missing blue carbuncle in the morning papers that may require our attention. He picked up his pipe, the master of his craft once more, leaving the dark alleys of the city behind as the light of a new day filled the room. The comforting aroma of fresh coffee and grilled kidneys soon replaced the acrid stench of nitrates and burning pitch that had clung to our clothes. Mrs. Hudson, ever the silent guardian of our domestic peace, moved about the room with a disapproving click of her tongue at the state of Holmes's soot-stained dressing gown. Yet she laid the table with a maternal care that spoke of her relief at our safe return. As the first sunlight of a clear winter morning began to stream through the windows, the horrors of Pentecost Alley seemed to recede into the realm of bad dreams, though the heavy lead cylinder still sitting upon the mahogany table remained as a cold physical reminder of the night's peril. "I suppose the official record will show a simple case of bullion theft and a tragic murder," I remarked, helping myself to the toast. "The public will never know how close the Admiralty came to a catastrophic breach of security." Holmes, who had finally exchanged his violin for a cup of strong tea, nodded slowly. "It is often the way, Watson. The more significant the service, the more silent the reward. The Admiralty will be profoundly grateful, no doubt, but their gratitude will manifest in the quiet suppression of the details. Sir James Saunders will be quietly removed from his positions, cited as having retired for reasons of health before his private trial. To expose his treason would be to admit a vulnerability the Empire cannot afford." "And Julian Willoughby? He has turned Queen's evidence," Holmes replied, his eyes following the steam rising from his cup. "His testimony against La Roche will be the final nail in the Frenchman's coffin. For his cooperation, I imagine his sentence will be light, though his reputation in the city is irrevocably shattered. He was a man of weak character, Watson, but not a murderer. He was the anvil upon which La Roche hammered out his schemes." I looked at my friend, struck by the ease with which he shifted from the frantic energy of the chase to the detached calm of the philosopher. "It is a singular thing, Holmes. You have dismantled a conspiracy that would have baffled the combined wits of Scotland Yard, yet you sit here as though you have done nothing more than solve a crossword puzzle. In many ways it is no more than that," he said, leaning back and lighting his first pipe of the day. "Life is a series of patterns, some more intricate than others." The mime thought he could create a pattern so chaotic that no eye could trace its origin, but he forgot that every mask leaves a mark, and every deception has a weight. Once one understands the mathematics of the human heart, its greeds, its fears, and its vanities, the rest is merely a matter of observation. "And Alistair Croft?" I asked quietly. "He died in terror, thinking his life's work was lost." Holmes's expression softened for a fleeting moment. "He died a hero, Watson, though a forgotten one. He knew the risk of following Laroche into that alley. He carried that vial of chloral hydrate not out of malice, but out of a desperate hope to stop a monster. If there is any justice in this world, his family will be taken care of by the very officials whose secrets he died to protect. I shall make it my personal business to ensure that a certain high-ranking member of the cabinet is reminded of his debt." The morning post arrived then, a small stack of envelopes carried up by the page boy. Holmes sifted through them with a practiced hand until he came upon a tattered, grease-stained note that seemed entirely out of place among the crisp stationery of the West End. He tore it open, and as he read, a sharp, eager light returned to his eyes. "Ah, the cycle begins anew," he cried, tossing the note across the table to me. "What did I tell you, Watson? The world is never short of puzzles for those who have eyes to see them. This is from a commissionaire at the Hotel Cosmopolitan. It seems a precious stone of immense value, the blue carbuncle no less, has vanished from a countess's jewellery case, and a poor goose seller in Covent Garden has been found with a very peculiar piece of evidence in his possession." I smiled, seeing the weariness of the previous night vanish instantly from his frame. The violin was forgotten, the Admiralty secrets were filed away, and the great mind of Sherlock Holmes was already reaching out for the next challenge. "It seems Simpsons must wait, Watson," he said, springing from his chair and reaching for his magnifying glass. "The game is afoot once more, and this time it involves a bird and a jewel rather than a furnace and a traitor. Put on your hat, man. The fog may have lifted, but the shadows of London are never entirely empty." As we descended the stairs together, I looked at the lean, energetic figure of my friend and felt a familiar surge of admiration. The case of the body in the Gaslit Alley was closed, another triumph added to the long chronicle of his genius. But as we stepped out into the crisp morning air of Baker Street, I knew that for Sherlock Holmes, the greatest mystery was always the one that lay just around the next corner.